mean, even when we're sitting comfortably in our chairs playing an engrossing video game, we're perfectly fine. There's nothing that can harm us in that game. And yet if we're absorbed enough in it, we still have anxiety. We still feel anxious about the dangers that are existing within the game. So too may the soul identify itself with the material nature, even though that material nature poses no threat to it. And just as the player of the game might get attached to the things he collects in the game, even though those things have no reality. I mean, we see this sometimes on social media. People build houses or collect gold coins or whatever in a particular game, and once that's destroyed, they feel so much anxiety about that. It never had any reality to begin with, and yet it's still causing us suffering. And so the soul may become attached to material things in the same way. Welcome back to Diary of Devotion's weekly study on the Bhagavad Gita. Last time we heard Krishna tell us about the importance of setting a good example in life, of seeking out like-minded people to help us along this path, and how great the pleasure that's generated from the self is. This week we're going to go deeper. We're going to learn a little bit more about how to set a good example for people, how to deal with people who are not on a spiritual path, and how to be people who want to seek God in a world that seems to have rejected Him. We're also going to learn a little bit about how we become entangled in material consciousness, and therefore how to avoid it. Okay, let's begin. Om Jnana-timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. Okay, beginning with chapter 3, text 25, Krishna says, "As the ignorant perform their duties with attachment to results, the learned may similarly act, but without attachment, for the sake of leading people on the right path." And so we see in the last episode, Krishna was saying that the person who has this transcendental consciousness, who's immersed in the self, has no duty yet to perform. And yet he's saying here that that person continues to perform that duty nonetheless. Even somebody who's attained perfection, who's attained detachment from worldly objects, they continue to act in the world simply to set the example for others. Okay, Krishna's going to expand on how to be that kind of person in text 26. He says, "So as not to disrupt the minds of ignorant men attached to the fruit of results of prescribed duties, a learned person should not induce them to stop work. Rather, by working in the spirit of devotion, he should engage them in all sorts of activities." So Krishna is emphasizing this fact that we all have our own particular natures. Some of us are going to give up attachment to material things very easily. Others will doggedly maintain attachment to those kinds of things. Maintaining dogged attachment is not wrong. It's just a result of our karmas. And so someone who's wise is not going to induce someone to give up material things when they're not ready to do it. That false renunciation of material things only leads to suffering for that particular person who's not ready to give it up. Rather, the process is to use those material things in the service of the Lord. You don't have to throw away all the things that you value. Simply turn around your consciousness of those things. Use them for the pleasure of the Lord instead of one's own pleasure. Okay, Krishna is going on in text 27. He says, "The spirit soul, bewildered by the influence of false ego, thinks himself the doer of activities that are in actuality carried out by the three modes of material nature." Now remember what the three modes of material nature are. That's goodness, passion, and ignorance. Those three ways of being, those three modes of consciousness are constantly acting on us. Sometimes we feel full of light, effulgent, free of suffering, and seeing everything around us equally. That's when we're in the mode of goodness. When we're compelled to get a lot of work done, when we're anxious about deadlines or accomplishing some goal, we're in the mode of passion. And when we're depressed, when we're induced to sleep, then we're in the mode of ignorance, that thing which keeps us inert. So it's actually these three modes of material nature that are impelling us to do the various things that we do on a daily basis. We think we're making the decisions to do those things, but actually it's the state of the consciousness that is impelling that. Krishna is saying this is just nature. This is not us doing those things. And so the whole point of meditation is to be able to realize the difference between our core selves and these modes of nature that are impelling our mind and body to move forward and do certain actions, or to stay still and become engrossed in depression or sleep. And so through the processes of meditation, once we have the ability to make that distinction, we can observe ourselves, we can observe our minds and bodies moving about through the world, doing actions, having thoughts, emotions coming in and out of our field of view. It's almost as if you're watching a movie. You realize that you are not the character in the movie. You're just witnessing the character in the movie. And so it is when we become immersed in the true self. We watch all the actions that we're doing as if it were a movie screen. And much like watching a movie, we come to realize that our body and our mind are not really under our control, just like the movie's not under our control. I might identify with the character in the movie, but I can't make it go left when I want it to go left. It simply does it. It does what it does. And so too with the material mind and body. It's controlled by the acquired nature that it has. We've all experienced this to some degree or another. Let's say I have a short temper. The slightest thing can just set me off. And no matter how hard I try to control that, I still act in an angry manner when the right stimuli comes along, almost helplessly. Almost helplessly. I'm not entirely helpless in the matter. And so just as I might choose positive, uplifting movies to watch, so too can I direct my consciousness to positive, uplifting things in life. I get to make choices about what I consume. If I'm constantly letting things into my field of vision that bring me low, that make me think of thoughts of exploitation, hatred, then my mind is naturally going to go toward a vision of the world around me that's a mirror of that. But when I choose to consume positivity, when I choose to condition myself to think positively about myself and the world around me, after a while, just like working out a muscle, the mind automatically goes down that route. I automatically start to see things in a positive light. Therein lies the importance of understanding the core inner self. Once I realize that, I can choose to direct my consciousness toward good things rather than destructive things. I'm just a little bit less under the control of my conditioning. And in that state where I'm a little bit less subject to negative conditioning, I can more attune myself to the voice of God. But wait a minute, if my core self does no actions, how is it that I can choose to direct my consciousness toward one thing or another? So this is going to come a little bit later in Bhagavad Gita, but I'll give you a little preview of it. Krishna is later going to explain to Arjuna that the nature of the soul is a duality. The core self is not sitting alone within the mind-body complex. It has a companion. It's always accompanied by the Paramatma, or the super soul. Super soul means like the soul of the soul. And this super soul, the soul of our soul, is the Lord Himself. He's commanding the body to do this or that, the mind to go down this path or that path. All we're doing is setting the intention. The intention is acted upon with the material mind and body by the Supreme Lord Himself. And so it's simple really. All we have to do is to ask the Lord, to pray sincerely, and to surrender it to Him and to say, please direct my consciousness toward you. In doing that, we realize that we're not the doer, and we pray to the Lord for His mercy to bring us to that state of God consciousness. And so in text 28, Krishna says, one who is in knowledge of the absolute truth, O mighty armed, does not engage himself in the senses and sense gratification, knowing well the difference between work and devotion and work for fruitive results. So what does that mean? He doesn't engage himself in the senses and sense gratification. It means that he no longer approaches the super soul, the Paramatma, that chunk of God within us, and say, please direct me toward this gratifying object. No, he does something completely different. He says, please direct my consciousness inward toward you, toward that God within me. And Krishna goes on, he says, bewildered by the modes of material nature, the ignorant fully engage themselves in material activities and become attached. But the wise should not unsettle them, although these duties are inferior due to the performer's lack of knowledge. Vishwanath Chakravarti asks an interesting question at this point. He says, if the eternal soul is unrelated to the material nature and has no connection to the activities generated therein, why does the soul become attached to material things? And Krishna said this previously, the soul is pure spirit. It's not made of material things. So if they're two completely different substances, how do they become attached to one another? So Krishna answers that question in this verse by saying that the soul becomes bewildered by the material nature. In other words, the soul becomes immersed in the three modes of material nature that we were just talking about and becomes falsely identified with it. Look at it this way. It's like someone who becomes addicted to playing video games and then identifies themselves with the character within that game. I mean, even when we're sitting comfortably in our chairs playing an engrossing video game, we're perfectly fine. There's nothing that can harm us in that game. And yet if we're absorbed enough in it, we still have anxiety. We still feel anxious about the dangers that are existing within the game. So too may the soul identify itself with the material nature, even though that material nature poses no threat to it. And just as the player of the game might get attached to the things he collects in the game, even though those things have no reality. I mean, we see this sometimes on social media. People build houses or collect gold coins or whatever in a particular game, and once that's destroyed, they feel so much anxiety about that. It never had any reality to begin with, and yet it's still causing us suffering. And so the soul may become attached to material things in the same way, even though those material things have no ultimate reality. They have no real connection with the soul. But just as the player eventually comes back to his normal state of consciousness once the game is turned off, so too does the soul regain its original state of consciousness when the material nature ceases to affect him. That's it. That's the point of detachment from material things. It's to come back to our original normal state of consciousness, in which we realize the eternal spiritual nature of who we are and are no longer falsely identifying with these temporary characters that are our minds and bodies. But the person who seeks out that truth is very rare. And it's often useless to unsettle and disturb someone who's absorbed in playing the game. Likewise, it's useless to unsettle and disturb those who lack the knowledge to understand that they are eternal souls. In both cases, the key to overcoming the addiction of false identification is to offer something better than what they currently have. In the case of the soul, that better thing that we don't have currently is freedom from the sufferings of material life and the ultimate pleasure of being within the self. That's the higher taste. That's what's available to us at the end of this path. But if somebody doesn't know that that exists, or doesn't believe that it exists, how can they be dissuaded simply by telling them that, you're doing something wrong, all of this is just illusion? They're not going to buy it. They're going to have to see evidence. And that evidence is attained through meditation. Okay, text 30, Krishna says, "Therefore, O Arjuna, surrendering all your works unto me, with full knowledge of me, without desire for profit, with no claims to proprietorship, and free from lethargy, fight." Remember, Arjuna's on a battlefield here. He has this prospect in front of him of having to face the wicked in combat. Krishna doesn't want him to shirk that duty. He wants him to fight for the right thing. What does that mean for us? This is an allegory for our own battle with the material nature. Don't give in. Don't stand still. Don't be lethargic. Get up with great vigor and fight to know that true inner self that you possess within you. So the person who becomes addicted to the false life of a video game may not know what he's missing out on. And indeed, he may actually get some kind of pleasure from that game that he's addicted to. But like all addictions, it ultimately leads to suffering. This is also the case with identifying with one's body, one's mind, family, occupation, nationality, even religion. It ultimately brings suffering. And as the Vaishnav commentator Tripurari Maharaj points out, the cure for the fever of material addiction is dedication to the Lord. Okay, so what are our takeaways for today? The first takeaway is, don't disturb people who are not ready for this message. People who are engrossed in the illusion of material existence, their consciousness is taken by that. Be grateful that you're here, that you're seeking something higher. And be grateful to have the association of other people who are also thinking that same thing, whether online or in person. But don't try to denigrate those who are not on this path. It only brings down both you and them. The second takeaway, we are not the doers of actions. When we're living in conditioned life, we're at the whims of our nature, of our acquired conditioning. If I've acquired a conditioning to get angry very easily, the slightest little thing is going to make me angry. The process of meditation and yoga is to progressively become more and more free from that conditioning. So in that sense, free will is a variable thing. We don't have one set amount of free will. Our free will varies depending on how hard packed our conditioning is. Once I have less conditioning, I'm less susceptible to the modes of material nature, and I can make freer choices. It's like breaking free of a smoking addiction. Once that conditioning is defeated, I can choose whether or not to do that. Takeaway number 3, we have to fight vigorously in order to attain a state like this. We have to confront the material nature within ourselves vigorously and work hard to get to that place. Why do we need to work hard to conquer this conditioning? Because we've worked hard to put that conditioning in place. I mean, how often when something stressful or anxiety-producing comes up, do we reach for some temporary material pleasure? That's a strong, ingrained reaction. And in order to dig ourselves out of that, it takes vigorous effort. But it's worth it. It's worthwhile. We no longer have to be subject to the conditionings of our mind. We no longer have to be subject to suffering. That fact alone makes it worthwhile. And beyond that, there's actual love of God waiting for us. Okay, that's it for this week. Love to hear what you have to say about all this. Put it in the comments below and I'll respond to you. And I'll see you next time. Jai Shri Radhe.